Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking really a crucial mission, decoding the mechanisms behind human prejudice.
Yeah, we're tackling one of the most, persistent and complicated questions in human society.
Right. Why do we divide ourselves into us and them? And, how does that division sometimes, maybe inevitably, transition from just simple preference into outright hostility?
It's a daunting challenge for sure, because the roots of group conflict are just so layered. You've got variables spanning from the internal or deep-seated psychological needs all the way out to the external things, like, the fight over resources or perceived threats.
Yeah, like existential threats even.
Exactly. And if you try to analyze any major conflict, whether it's geopolitical, cultural, even stuff in the workplace, these elements are always interacting. It's never just one thing.
Right. So our mission today is to try and pull apart the key social and group-level theories that explain how prejudice gets generated and, crucially, how it's sustained. We're synthesizing some pretty dense research here, focused squarely on the social context of this issue. We're covering 4 major interconnected frameworks.
That's right. We've got social identity theory, then relative deprivation theory, realistic conflict theory, and finally, intergroup threat theory.
We're going to use those frameworks to try and understand the dynamics at the most, volatile level, looking at the extreme endpoint of formalized hate group membership.
Yeah, to really see how these theories kind of manifest in the real world, often in the most stark form.
So our goal for you, the listener, is to give you a genuine, comprehensive shortcut. By the end of this deep dive, hopefully you'll be able to categorize and analyze intergroup dynamics in real time.
You'll be able to recognize, okay, is the engine driving this conflict primarily psychological? Is it driven by a sense of unfairness? Or is it really about competition for resources?
Exactly. We're moving from that internal psychological necessity of belonging all the way out to the external fight over who gets what.
Okay, let's unpack this then. By starting with the most basic building block of us versus them, how we actually define ourselves.
Yeah.
Which brings us straight to the psychological foundation of social identity theory, or SIT.
SIT is, I think, the perfect place to start because it really roots the bias within the individual's self-concept, but specifically how that self-concept relates to a group.
Okay.
Think of your self-concept as having 2 parts. You've got your personal identity, your unique traits, skills, personality, all that stuff. And then you have your social identity. And this social identity is the part of your self-concept that you derive directly from your membership in groups that are important to you.
So that could be anything, right? Like your family, your college.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your sports team, your family, your college alumni network, your national citizenship, any group that matters to you contributes to this social identity.
And what's the driving force behind this? What's the motivation? Well, the fundamental motivation underpinning all of this, according to SIT, is the drive to develop and maintain social identities that are, 1, positive, and 2, successfully differentiate our group from others.
So we want to feel good about our groups, and we need them to be distinct, like special somehow.
Precisely. We want to be part of the winning team, conceptually speaking, and we need that team to be distinct, unique, and ideally, clearly superior in some way, at least in our own minds.
Okay, and that drive leads directly to something called in-group bias.
Yes. When you identify strongly with your in-group, you automatically tend to perceive that in-group, and by extension yourself, because you're part of it, more positively than the out-group.
And this isn't necessarily based on logic or experience.
Not primarily, no. It's presented as more of an internal psychological necessity. We need to feel good about the groups we belong to, so we tend to view them through rose-tinted glasses, you could say.
To really understand how fundamental this is, the sources point to these crucial experiments, the ones using the minimal group paradigm. Can you walk us through how they tested this? Because the results sound pretty stunning.
They really are. Researchers wanted to find the absolute minimum condition required to trigger this in-group bias. So what they did was create completely arbitrary, basically meaningless groups in the lab.
Arbitrary how?
Like, participants might be shown a couple of abstract paintings by Klee and Kandinsky and then told, okay, you're in the Klee group or you're in the Kandinsky group, based purely on which painting you said you preferred slightly more.
So totally random, no real meaning behind it.
Exactly. The groups were anonymous, members didn't interact, they had no shared history, the groups had no future beyond the experiment, just a label.
Okay, so no shared history, no goal, no interaction. Just the label Klee or Kandinsky.
Correct. And then came the key part. Participants were asked to distribute resources, usually points or small amounts of money, to other participants who were identified only by their group membership, like participant #3 Klee group or participant #7 Kandinsky group.
And they had choices in how to distribute this.
Yes, they used these matrices that often forced a choice. You could choose to maximize the total payout for everyone involved, regardless of group, or you could maximize the payout just for your own in-group members. Or, and this is critical, you could choose an option that maximized the difference between what your group got and what the other group got, even if it meant your own group got less overall than they could have with another option.
And what did people typically choose?
Overwhelmingly, the finding is that participants consistently chose to allocate more resources to members of their own arbitrary group. And often, they specifically chose the strategy that maximized the difference between the groups, favoring relative gain over absolute gain.
So they'd rather win against the other group, even if it meant getting less stuff overall.
Exactly. It's astonishing. Bias occurs simply because of the categorization. You don't need a history of conflict. You don't need competition over real stakes. You just need an us label and a them label. The driving motivation seems to be achieving this positive distinctiveness for the in-group, not necessarily maximizing profit.
Wow. That distinction, positive group differentiation over maximum gain, that really is key. It tells us the bias is baked right into the categorization process itself. Now, SIT offers two main hypotheses to explain why this happens, right? Starting with the categorization competition hypothesis.
That's the first one. This hypothesis basically says that merely classifying people into in-groups and out-groups is in itself enough to generate competitive feelings.
It's the act of sorting?
Yeah. When your social identity gets activated, like being told you're in the Klee group, your cognitive system naturally organizes the social world into these distinct, contrasting categories. It's the classic us versus them mental sorting.
And that sorting automatically triggers competitive feelings, like wanting your group to come out on top.
That's the idea. It arouses competitive feelings and a desire to favor your own group, to make sure us looks better than them. This is proposed as the mechanism behind that in-group favoritism we see even in the minimal group studies.
Okay. But there's a cognitive side effect to this simplification, isn't there? Something called outgroup homogeneity bias.
That's right. It's a really important consequence. Outgroup homogeneity bias is our tendency to perceive members of the outgroup as being much more similar to each other than they actually are.
Like they're all the same.
Pretty much. We tend to see the rich diversity, the nuances, the individuality within our own in-group. We're all unique, but we mentally lump the outgroup together into a kind of undifferentiated mass. Oh, those people, they all think alike, act alike.
And that simplification helps maintain the sharp us versus them boundary.
Exactly. It makes the categories cleaner, crisper, which in turn fuels the bias. It's easier to feel competitive against a monolithic them.
Okay, so categorization provides this sort of the mental mechanism. The second major explanation from SIT, the self-esteem hypothesis, gives us the psychological fuel, right? The why behind the why.
Precisely. This hypothesis focuses on the link between our group memberships and our personal sense of self-worth. Simply put, when a group you identify with does well, you feel good about yourself. Your group's successes become your successes vicariously.
And SIT proposes, what, 3 specific ways self-esteem gets involved in this?
Yes, 3 key roles.
Yeah.
The first is pretty straightforward. Engaging in in-group bias itself reinforces a positive social identity. By demonstrating, even just to yourself, that your in-group is superior, your connection to that group becomes a stronger source of self-worth. It feels good to be part of a winning group.
Makes sense. What's the second role?
The second role is maybe a bit more counterintuitive. The research suggests that people who report having lower personal self-esteem are often more likely to engage in intergroup bias.
Really? Why's that?
It seems to function as a strategy to raise their personal self-esteem. If I feel inadequate on a personal level, I can kind of borrow prestige or feel better about myself by emphasizing how wonderful or talented or morally superior my group is compared to some outgroup. It's a way to compensate.
Interesting. Almost like propping yourself up by pushing others down group-wise.
You could see it that way, yeah. And the third role is purely defensive.
Defensive how?
If your personal self-esteem is threatened by something external, maybe you receive negative feedback at work, or you fail an exam, or face some personal setback, you can immediately defend your sense of self-worth by leaning into in-group bias.
How does that work?
By strongly asserting your group superiority, you reaffirm your value indirectly. Okay, maybe I messed up, but at least my team, my college is still the best. It acts as an instant psychological buffer against the personal threat.
So it's not just about achieving positive distinction, it's also about having this ready-made defense against personal failures. The group identity becomes like an ego shield.
Exactly right. It's a powerful motivator.
Okay, so we understand the bias and the self-esteem link. But what factors influence how strongly we identify with a particular group in the first place? You mentioned self-categorization.
Yeah, self-categorization is key. The likelihood that you'll categorize yourself primarily as a member of a specific group increases dramatically as the perceived difference between your in-group and a relevant out-group increases.
So the bigger the gap, the stronger the identity.
Generally, yes. When the contrast is really sharp, when they seem very different from us, our identity as us becomes much more salient and solidifies.
And when that identity gets strong, it can trigger something called self-stereotyping.
Correct. This is where group members start to actually view themselves in terms of the positive stereotypes associated with their group.
So if my group is seen as, say, hardworking,
Then you might start to perceive yourself as more hardworking because you belong to that group, internalizing that positive trait. The self literally becomes one with the group in that aspect, which further enhances your positive self-perception.
now there's a refinement to this idea of just wanting distinctiveness, right? This concept of optimal distinctiveness.
Yes, this is an important modification. It suggests we aren't just seeking any distinct group identity, we're trying to strike a balance. We have a fundamental need to belong, to be affiliated with others. We don't want to be completely isolated.
How about?
But we also have a need for differentiation, for uniqueness. We don't want to be completely submerged in a massive anonymous crowd where our individuality is lost.
So we're looking for a sweet spot.
Exactly. Optimal distinctiveness theory proposes that people are most strongly attracted to and identify with groups that offer the most satisfying balance between these two competing needs, the need for inclusion and the need for distinctiveness. Not too unique, not too assimilated.
That makes a lot of sense. It helps explain why maybe smaller, more specialized subcultures or groups can generate such intense loyalty, maybe even more than huge, vague categories like all men or all women.
Absolutely. That group provides both belonging and a clear sense of unique identity. The search for this optimal balance can drive individuals away from groups that feel too large or indistinct and towards ones that offer that satisfying equilibrium.
Okay. What else strengthens identification? You mentioned threat to the group.
Oh, absolutely. External threats are a powerful catalyst. When events happen that pose a clear danger or challenge to the group's well-being, existence, or values.
Like the September 11th attacks are often cited here.
That's a classic tragic example. Events like that generate a significantly stronger, more immediate, and more unified identification with the threatened group. In that case, national identity surged. It's a powerful defensive mechanism where the boundaries tighten and solidarity increases under pressure.
And then some identities are just always there, right?
Yeah.
Chronic social identities.
Yes, these are the identities that are consistently important and central to a person's self-concept, regardless of the specific situation they're in. Think about things like race, ethnicity, gender, or maybe a deeply held religious identity for some people.
They're always on.
Pretty much. They operate alongside more situational identities and individual differences like personality. These chronic identities contribute heavily to the stability of our overall social identity landscape and, consequently, our baseline predispositions towards certain in-group biases.
Okay, before we move on from SIT, it's a really critical nuance we need to touch on. Does liking your own group automatically mean you have to dislike or reject the outgroup? Is in-group favoritism the same as outgroup hate?
That's a really common assumption, but the research suggests it's not necessarily a direct link. In-group favoritism, preferring your own group, giving them benefits, rating them more positively, does not automatically translate into active rejection, hostility, or derogation of the outgroup.
So you can like your team without actively wanting the other team to fail miserably.
Exactly. You can have pride in your group without needing to tear down another group. There are conditions where tolerance is perfectly compatible with strong in-group identity.
And what are those conditions? When is tolerance more likely?
Tolerance is more likely, according to the theory, if the in-group doesn't view its own values, beliefs, or ways of life as inherently more valid or universally superior to the outgroup's ways.
So if you see your culture as just one legitimate way among many,
then you're less likely to feel the need to denigrate or reject the outgroup's culture just because it's different. It allows for a kind of live and let live approach, even with strong in-group pride.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, building on that. because the opposite of that rigid, only our way is right view seems to be a powerful defense against prejudice. The sources highlight that the more complex a person's social identity is,
Meaning they belong to and identify with many different, perhaps cross-cutting or non-overlapping groups.
the more tolerant that person tends to be of other groups in general.
That is a critical finding, absolutely. If your sense of self is drawn from multiple sources, maybe you identify strongly as a parent and a scientist and a fan of a particular music genre and a volunteer for a local charity.
Right, lots of different use categories.
Exactly. Those multiple identities provide multiple frames of reference. It reduces the singular importance of any one in-group, out-group distinction. It naturally softens the boundaries and makes the world seem less like a simple us versus them battleground. Complexity breeds tolerance.
We see this whole SIT framework play out really powerfully when we look at national identity, don't we? The extent to which someone identifies with their country.
Definitely. Just like with smaller groups, threats to the nation, economic downturns, security crises, perceived cultural challenges can significantly increase people's identification with their national group. You see waves of patriotism surge.
And that surge in national identification, particularly during times of threat, often leads directly to prejudice, right? Especially towards immigrants or other groups perceived as outsiders.
Yes, that link is well documented. Outsiders might be seen as violating the group boundaries, competing for resources, or challenging core national values, triggering that defensive in-group favoritism, which can manifest as prejudice.
But again, it's not automatic. The relationship between national identity and prejudice is moderated by how people define that national identity. The sources distinguish between an ethnic view and a civic view.
That's a crucial distinction. If someone holds an ethnic view of nationality, they define the nation primarily by shared ancestry, bloodlines, maybe a common culture or religion. It's about who you are inherently. This view tends to be quite rigid and exclusionary.
Versus a civic view.
The civic view defines the nation based on shared laws, political institutions, commitment to a set of ideals or principles. It's about shared citizenship and values, not shared blood. This view is inherently more open to including people from diverse backgrounds.
And the research shows.
When the ethnic view of national identity is dominant or strongly held by individuals, prejudice toward outsiders, particularly immigrants, tends to be significantly higher. The civic view is generally associated with more tolerance.
Okay, another factor here, and it sounds pretty toxic, is group narcissism. What is that exactly?
Yeah, this is a particularly problematic form of in-group identification. Group narcissism is defined as this inflated, almost grandiose belief in the absolute superiority of one's own country or group over all others.
Okay.
Coupled with a strong denial or outright refusal to acknowledge any negative aspects of the in-group historical wrongdoings, current flaws, any weaknesses. It's belief in in-group perfection and superiority combined with extreme defensiveness.
Wow. So it's not just pride, it's pride plus blindness to faults.
Exactly. And that combination creates an in-group boundary that is incredibly rigid, defensive, and hypersensitive to any perceived criticism or threat. It turns national pride into a kind of aggressive, brittle defensiveness, making perceived out-group threats seem much more intense and hostility almost inevitable.
And finally, the country's actual environment matters too, right? Its commitment to diversity.
Yes, the broader societal context plays a role. If the dominant culture and institutions actively promote diversity and inclusion as core national values, it can help temper that natural psychological tendency towards in-group favoritism and exclusion that SIT describes. It provides a counter-narrative.
Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture now, social identity theory explains why we like our group, why we need it to be distinct, mostly stemming from these internal psychological needs like self-esteem and belonging.
Right, it's the internal engine.
But, as, conflict theorists might say, it often comes down to resources, to stuff. What happens when these external factors like competition or fairness come into play?
Yeah, this is where we move from the abstract identity processes to more concrete conflicts, which takes us into our next section, looking at relative deprivation theory and realistic conflict theory.
This feels like a major shift in focus. SIT was about what we need inside our heads. These theories seem to be about what we fight over out in the world.
That's a good way to put it.
Let's start with relative deprivation theory. This moves beyond just identity to the feeling of dissatisfaction, of resentment. How does it explain how people get unhappy and, crucially, who they blame.
The core idea of RDT revolves around comparison. People don't necessarily become dissatisfied just because they are objectively lacking something. Dissatisfaction arises when they compare their current situation to one of two things.
Okay.
Either they compare it to a similar situation in their past where they felt they were better off, or they compare themselves to other people or groups they see as similar to themselves who seem to be doing better.
So it's all relative.
Exactly. And if, as a result of that comparison, they conclude that they lack some resource or outcome that they feel they deserve to have, that's when the trouble starts. They perceive the situation as fundamentally unfair, and that perceived unfairness leads to dissatisfaction and resentment.
This idea of deserving sounds important. It brings in this justice framework that RDT uses, right?
Yeah.
Starting with distributive justice.
Yes. Distributive justice is all about the perceived fairness of how outcomes, things like rewards, resources, promotions, grades, are distributed. The expectation is usually that outcomes should be based on merit or contribution. People who deserve more should get more.
And if that doesn't happen?
If you believe you put in the most effort but got the smallest reward, or someone less qualified got the promotion you felt you deserved, you perceive low distributive justice. That violation of expectation creates immediate dissatisfaction, maybe anger, certainly resentment.
And that feeling gets worse if the process itself felt rigged. That's procedural justice.
Precisely. Procedural justice isn't about the outcome itself, but about the perceived fairness of the process used to arrive at that outcome. Was the decision-making process transparent? Were the rules applied consistently? Did everyone have a voice?
So sticking with the promotion example.
Low procedural justice would be if the criteria for the promotion seemed to change halfway through, or if the boss clearly favored one candidate, regardless of qualifications. If the outcome feels unfair and the process used to get there felt biased or unfair, the resentment is compounded. It feels like the whole system is stacked against you.
Okay, so we have dissatisfaction brewing from perceived unfairness. How does RDT explain this turning into prejudice against another group?
It becomes prejudice when people take that dissatisfaction and successfully identify a specific outgroup as the cause of their deprivation. They need to blame someone.
They assign blame?
Yes. They decide it's that group's fault that we're not getting what we deserve. Maybe they believe the outgroup is unfairly taking resources or benefiting from a biased system or actively blocking the in-group's progress. That shift from generalized dissatisfaction, things are unfair, to targeted blame, they're making things unfair for us, is what develops into dislike, hostility, and prejudice toward that outgroup.
Now, this seems logical, but the sources highlight a really crucial distinction here, one that often surprises people. What about personal hardship? If I, as an individual, feel deprived, we call that personal relative deprivation, does that make me more prejudiced?
It's surprising, but the research consistently finds that no, not really. Personal relative deprivation, the feeling that you specifically are worse off than you deserve to be compared to your past or others like you, is generally not strongly related to prejudice or hostility towards outgroups.
What does it lead to then?
It's more likely to lead to things like depression, anxiety, maybe stress, or perhaps it motivates personal ambition to improve your own situation, but it doesn't typically translate into blaming an entire outgroup.
But the key driver of prejudice, according to RDT, is group relative deprivation.
Absolutely. This is the critical factor. It's the belief that my group, the in-group I belong to, is being deprived of benefits or outcomes we deserve, especially when compared to where our group used to be or compared to some relevant outgroup that seems to be doing better.
So it's the collective feeling.
Yes, it's that sense of shared collective injury, the feeling that we as a group are being cheated, wronged, or held back. That collective resentment is what strongly and consistently predicts intergroup hostility, prejudice, and the desire to blame a visible them.
And interestingly, the sources mention the flip side too, relative gratification. You might think feeling better off would lead to harmony, but not always.
Right. Both deprivation and gratification can fuel prejudice, just through different mechanisms.
How so?
If your group feels relatively deprived, you focus on the perceived losses and resentment towards the group you blame for those losses. But if your group feels relatively gratified, meaning you believe your in-group is clearly better off than other groups...
You feel superior.
Exactly. That feeling of superiority can lead you to want to protect that privileged position. It can justify looking down on the groups that are worse off, perhaps stereotyping them as lazy or inferior to rationalize their lower status. So resentment from deprivation and arrogance from gratification can both end up promoting prejudice.
Okay, that makes sense. Which leads us directly into realistic conflict theory. RCT. If RDT is about the feeling of unfairness over resources, RCT seems to be about the actual struggle for them.
Precisely. RCT offers a very pragmatic, almost economic perspective on prejudice. The basic premise is that humans and groups are fundamentally motivated to maximize the rewards they receive in life: resources, status, power.
And when those resources are scarce.
When resources are limited or perceived to be limited, groups often find themselves in competition. And RCT argues that dislike, hostility, and prejudice towards outgroups stem directly from this competition for valuable, scarce resources. It's a fight over tangible things.
The classic, almost legendary demonstration of this is the Robbers Cave demonstration, right? The Sharif studies at the summer camp.
Absolutely. Muzaffar and Carolyn Sharif's work in the late 40s and early 50s is foundational here. They ran these incredibly insightful field experiments with 11 to 12-year-old boys at a remote summer camp.
What do they do?
Well, the study had distinct phases. First, they divided the boys, who didn't know each other beforehand, into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers. They let each group bond separately through typical camp activities: hiking, swimming, building things. This allowed strong group cohesion, norms, and leadership structures to emerge naturally within each group.
So they created two distinct, tight-knit in-groups first.
Exactly. Then, in the crucial second stage, they brought the two groups together specifically for direct competition. They set up a tournament with games like baseball, tug-of-war, and treasure hunts, with desirable prizes at stake: medals, trophies, really cool pocket knives the boys wanted.
And the outcome?
It was explosive and almost immediate. The introduction of this zero-sum competition where one group's win meant the other group's loss was sufficient to generate intense intergroup hostility.
We're not talking just friendly rivalry here.
Oh no, it escalated quickly. We're talking about derogatory name-calling, taunting, flag-burning. They made flags for their groups, raiding each other's cabins, collecting ammunition like green apples to throw at each other. Even physical fights broke out.
Wow. Just from competing for prizes.
Yes. The Sharifs concluded that the mere existence of two groups competing for goals that only one group could attain was enough to produce hostility, negative stereotyping of the outgroup, and even outright aggression. When resources are zero-sum, conflict seems almost inevitable.
That's powerful. Did they try to fix it? What happened when they tried to just bring them together for fun stuff, non-competitive things?
That's another key finding. After the hostility peaked, the researchers tried introducing pleasant, non-competitive contact situations. Things like watching movies together, eating meals in the same dining hall, shooting off fireworks.
Did it help reduce the friction?
Not at all. In fact, it often made things worse. The boys used these occasions for more conflict: food fights, continued insults. Just being near each other didn't help. The animosity was too ingrained by the competition.
So what did work?
What finally worked was introducing superordinate goals. These were urgent problems or desirable goals that were larger than either group and required the cooperation of both groups to solve.
Like what?
Things like fixing the camp's water supply, which had supposedly broken down, or pooling their money together because neither group had enough on its own to rent a movie they all wanted to see, or helping push the camp truck when it got stuck.
So they had to work together.
Exactly. Facing these shared challenges forced the boys to stop seeing each other purely as rivals and start seeing each other as necessary partners. And successfully working together on these superordinate goals dramatically reduced the prejudice, the negative stereotypes, and the hostility between the Eagles and the Rattlers.
That finding about superordinate goals seems incredibly relevant today.
Immensely so. The core findings of Robbers Cave competition breeds conflict. Mere contact isn't enough. Cooperation towards shared goals reduces friction have held up remarkably well over decades and across cultures.
Now, contemporary views of RCT have broadened the idea of resources, right? It's not just about pocket knives or territory anymore.
That's right. The focus has shifted to intergroup competition more broadly, acknowledging that groups also compete fiercely over less tangible, more cultural resources.
Like what kind of things?
Things like political power, ideological dominance, control over religious expression, whose cultural values get reflected in laws and education systems. These symbolic or cultural resources can be just as hotly contested as material ones.
And this leads to the instrumental model of intergroup competition. What does that add?
The instrumental model takes a colder, more strategic view. It suggests that prejudice and discrimination aren't just unfortunate emotional byproducts of competition. Instead, they are often consciously or unconsciously used as tools or strategies.
Tools for what?
Specifically, tools used by dominant or majority groups to actively limit or reduce competition from subordinate groups, thereby protecting or enhancing the dominant group's own access to resources and maintaining their advantage.
So prejudice becomes a tactic to keep others down and preserve your group's position.
Essentially, yes. If a dominant group feels threatened by a rising subordinate group, they might use negative stereotypes to justify paying them lower wages, or implement policies that make it harder for them to access education or political influence. It's discrimination serving a functional, albeit morally questionable, purpose for the dominant group.
What triggers this perception of competition according to the model? What are the antecedents?
The sources point to three main triggers. First, simply the dominant group's desire to increase its own resources, maybe at the expense of another group, basic group self-interest or greed.
Okay.
Second, actual or even just perceived scarcity of resources.
Yeah.
When times are tough and it feels like there isn't enough to go around, competition naturally heats up.
And the third?
Third, and very importantly, when subordinate groups start advocating for a fair distribution of resources or challenging the status quo, that advocacy, that demand for change, is often perceived by the dominant group not as a legitimate claim for justice, but as a direct, unwarranted threat to their established position and resources.
And certain worldviews or ideologies make people more likely to see things this way. You mentioned ideological antecedents.
Yes, two key ideologies consistently pop up in the research as fueling competitive intergroup perceptions: social dominance orientation, SDO, and right-wing authoritarianism, RWA. It's important we clarify what these mean, as the sources use them quite a bit.
Okay, break them down for us. What's SDO?
SDO, social dominance orientation, is basically a personality trait or worldview reflecting the extent to which someone desires and supports group-based hierarchy and inequality in society. People high in SDO believe it's natural, maybe even desirable, for some groups to dominate others.
So they're comfortable with inequality.
Yes, they tend to accept and even prefer social systems where groups are clearly stratified. They naturally thrive in competitive, zero-sum environments and are highly likely to view any challenge to the existing hierarchy by a lower status group as a threat to the proper natural order of things.
Okay, and RWA, right-wing authoritarianism.
RWA is conceptualized a bit differently. It's seen as a cluster of three related attitudes or traits. First, a high degree of submission to authorities perceived as established and legitimate. Second, generalized aggression directed towards people or groups that those authorities identify as targets. And third, a strong adherence to traditional social norms and conventions.
How does that fuel competition?
People high in RWA tend to see the world as a dangerous, threatening place. They're highly sensitive to perceived threats to the existing social order, tradition, and security. While SDO focuses on dominance and hierarchy, RWA focuses more on order, conformity, and defense against perceived threats, especially symbolic ones that challenge traditional values. Both, however, predispose individuals to see intergroup relations in competitive and potentially hostile terms.
Okay, let's look at the consequences of this competition, which the sources say depend heavily on the power dynamics between the groups. What happens when you have competition with an equal group?
That's the robber's cave scenario, basically. When groups have roughly equal power and are competing for the same scarce resources, the outgroup is seen as a direct obstacle or threat to achieving those resources. This typically leads to mutual hostility, derogation, and conflict, as we saw with the Eagles and Rattlers.
But the dynamic is totally different when one group clearly dominates the other, right?
Yeah.
Domination of an outgroup by the in-group.
Absolutely. When one group wins the competition and establishes dominance, the dynamic shifts from active conflict to exploitation and justification. The winning dominant group often exploits the losing group for resources or labor. They come to see the subordinate group as inherently inferior to justify this unequal relationship.
And they use stereotypes to do that.
Yes, negative stereotyping becomes crucial. It serves to derogate the subordinate group, portraying them as lazy, unintelligent, or otherwise undeserving, which rationalizes their lower status and the ongoing exploitation. This perfectly reinforces the hierarchical worldview favored by those high in SDO.
Now, how the subordinate group responds to this domination is critical. The sources describe two possibilities, starting with stable oppression.
In a situation of stable oppression, the subordinate group essentially accepts the dominant group's ideology and view of the world, including the view that the dominant group is superior and their own group is inferior.
They buy into it.
To some extent, yes. They submit to the dominant group's power, largely to avoid open conflict and further punishment. Tragically, sometimes members of the subordinated group may even internalize the negative stereotypes about themselves, adopt the dominant group's values, and reject their own cultural heritage.
This sounds like that concept of false consciousness.
Exactly. False consciousness is when a subordinate group holds beliefs or attitudes that are actually contrary to their own objective best interests, but which serve to maintain the existing system of inequality and their own disadvantaged position. It's the heartbreaking outcome, where the oppressed essentially help perpetuate their own oppression by accepting the oppressor's narrative. It makes the hierarchy very stable and self-sustaining.
But that submission isn't inevitable. What happens if the oppression becomes unstable?
This is the turning point. In unstable oppression, the subordinate group starts to reject the dominant group's ideology, the negative stereotypes, and their assigned lower status. They develop a stronger sense of in-group solidarity, start to see the dominant group clearly as oppressive, and develop hostility towards them.
And critically, they challenge the system.
Yes, they begin to actively challenge the dominant group's power and legitimacy. This challenge is the moment of crisis, the point where the established order is threatened.
And the dominant group's reaction to that challenge is crucial for what happens next.
Absolutely critical. If the dominant group perceives the challenge as unjustified, perhaps seeing it as an unwarranted grab for power, maybe fueled by RWA fears about disrupting tradition or order, they typically respond with increased hostility.
Oh, so?
They intensify the derogation and negative stereotyping of the subordinate group to justify maintaining the status quo. They frame the challenging group as dangerous, unreasonable, threatening, and inferior, thereby legitimizing repressive measures to keep them down.
But what if the challenge is seen as justified? The sources mentioned the U.S. Civil Rights Movement as an example here.
Right. If, for various reasons, the dominant group comes to view the subordinate group's claims and challenge as legitimate, as reflecting genuine injustice, then the dynamic shifts again.
Towards tolerance.
So it's a form of tolerance, yes. The dominant group may acknowledge the legitimacy of the grievances, which allows the subordinate group to gain some measure of power to demand and implement changes. However, the sources do caution that this tolerance can often be superficial.
Superficial how?
It might be more of a strategic calculation by the dominant group to maintain overall stability by granting some concessions, rather than a deep, genuine shift in attitudes or a willingness to fully relinquish privilege. It allows change, but often controlled change on the dominant group's terms.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We have the internal psychological needs driving identity from SIT. We have the external factors of perceived unfairness from RDT, and the struggle over resources from RCT. So what does this all mean when you put it together?
Yeah, how do we synthesize this?
This is where Intergroup Threat Theory, or ITT, comes in, right? It provides an answer by merging these internal needs and external struggles.
Exactly. ITT is really powerful because it integrates these different perspectives. It moves beyond just competition for tangible stuff to also incorporate those deeper psychological fears about losing identity, culture, status, the things SIT talks about.
And it proposes that prejudice stems from two main types of perceived threat.
Yes, two primary integrated types of threat that often operate together. The first is realistic threats.
Okay, what falls under realistic threats?
These are the threats based on that intergroup conflict and competition we just discussed with RCT. They concern tangible things that affect the group's power, resources, and physical well-being.
So, like economic competition, fears of crime.
Exactly. Competition for jobs or housing, concerns about political power shifting, fears of physical harm from the outgroup, the feeling of group relative deprivation. They're getting ahead at our expense. It even includes the basic anxiety people might feel just interacting with members of an outgroup in an uncertain or tense environment. These are the practical, measurable concerns.
We are taking our jobs, their political power reduces ours, they pose a physical danger, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Those are realistic threats.
And the second type is symbolic threats. What are those?
Symbolic threats are quite different. They're based on perceived differences in fundamental values, beliefs, morals, attitudes, religion, ideology, the core cultural elements that define the in-group's identity and way of life.
So this is less about stuff and more about identity, culture.
Yeah, exactly. Symbolic threats are concerns that the outgroup, simply by being different or promoting different values, is undermining the in-group's entire worldview, their sense of cultural integrity, maybe even their collective self-esteem, or the perceived legitimacy of their way of life.
So their values clash with ours. Their traditions are eroding our culture. Their beliefs threaten our moral standards.
Yes. These intangible fears about cultural integrity and identity are often incredibly potent, sometimes even more potent and harder to resolve than realistic threats, because they strike at the very definition of who we are. They feel existential in a different way.
And the power of ITT is that it brings these together.
Yes, the ITT model proposes that prejudice arises when you have a high level of in-group identification, coming from SIT principles, combined with the perception of either realistic threat or symbolic threat, although very often both types of threats are perceived simultaneously. That combination is what directly leads to prejudice and hostility toward the outgroup.
Can you give an example of how they combine?
Sure, think about debates around immigration in many countries. You often hear concerns about the realistic threats, the perceived strain on social services, competition for jobs or housing.
Okay.
But those concerns are almost always intertwined with symbolic threats. Fears that the immigrants' different languages, religions, or cultural norms are somehow eroding the traditional national identity or values.
I see. It's the combination.
Exactly. It's that potent mix. They are taking our stuff and they are undermining our way of life that seems to drive the most intense, persistent, and difficult to resolve forms of prejudice, according to ITT.
Okay, this integration makes a lot of sense. Now, what's fascinating, as you mentioned earlier, is how these theories, identity, deprivation, conflict, threat, all seem to converge when we look at the most extreme, formalized endpoint: hate group membership.
Yes, these groups provide a stark, almost pathological case study. They seem to exemplify these theoretical dynamics in action. First, let's define what we mean by a hate group. Based on the sources, a hate group is generally defined as an organization whose central principles explicitly include hostility and animosity toward other groups, usually based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Their core reason for existing is this hostility.
And what do they actually do? We might imagine constant violence, but the sources suggest something different.
That's an important point. While their rhetoric is often violent and filled with hate, the sources we looked at indicate that these groups actually rarely engage in organized violence themselves as a primary activity. Their main activities tend to focus more on ideological reinforcement, recruitment, and community building within the group.
So things like,
Membership meetings, rallies, protests, distributing propaganda materials, pamphlets, websites, music, and even social events like family picnics or gatherings. The primary function seems to be creating and sustaining an ideological community built on hate.
okay, so if they're not primarily about violence, why do people join these groups? What draws them in?
The pathway often starts, according to the sources, with what's termed everyday racism.
What does that mean?
Everyday racism is defined here as the sort of background, often unexamined assumption, found particularly in much of North American culture, but arguably elsewhere too, that European Christian values and cultural norms are the default, the correct, or the only legitimate standard.
So it's a kind of ambient cultural bias.
Yeah, it creates a cultural environment where negative stereotypes and subtly biased views about people who don't fit that norm can exist almost unnoticed. Hate groups then actively work to tap into this latent everyday racism and try to convert it into something the sources call extraordinary racism,
Yes.
which is a much more formalized, conscious, aggressive, and often militant hostility directed squarely at those outgroups. It takes the background bias and weaponizes it into an ideology.
And people who join are often looking for something.
Often, yes. The sources suggest people drawn to these groups are frequently seeking clear, simple answers to complex and troubling questions. These can be big philosophical questions, the meaning of life, their purpose, but also practical problems.
Like what?
Like finding solutions to personal grievances, anxieties about social change, or feeling like the world is going wrong and wanting a way to make it better according to their specific, rigid worldview.
And hate groups offer easy answers.
They offer very simple, very cohesive narratives. They essentially say, yes, the world is confusing and maybe scary, but we understand what's happening. We know who is to blame, usually specific outgroup, and we have the solution. This provides immediate, satisfying answers.
And it taps into those theories we discussed.
Absolutely. It provides a strong, positive, highly distinct group identity, SIT, clearly identifies an outgroup to blame for perceived deprivation or unfairness, RDT, and frames the world in terms of constant threat and competition from that outgroup, RTT and ITT. It checks all the boxes.
Now, there's a common stereotype about who joins these groups: poor, uneducated people. Is that accurate according to the research?
Not generally, no. That's largely a myth. The research cited suggests that most people who join hate groups are actually middle class and reasonably well educated.
That's surprising.
It is, and it really underscores the point that formalized prejudice isn't just a result of desperation or ignorance. It can be a strategic, ideological response to perceived group competition and threat, appealing to people across different socioeconomic strata who feel their group status or identity is under siege.
How does recruitment actually work then? Do people just seek these groups out?
Mostly no. The data suggests most members don't actively go looking for a hate group to join. Instead, they are typically recruited, and usually by someone they already know and trust.
A friend, a family member.
Exactly, a friend, a relative, a coworker. And it's usually presented as a gradual process, not some sudden conversion experience. It's more like easing someone into the ideology and the social network.
And they use this normalizing effect. How does that work?
Recruitment often starts quite subtly. Potential recruits might be invited to seemingly innocuous social events like a barbecue, a picnic, a concert, maybe a family-friendly gathering.
Why do that?
It's tactical. It presents the group members and the general milieu as normal, friendly, maybe a bit alternative, but fundamentally relatable people. It creates a sense of community and belonging before hitting them with the most extreme aspects of the ideology. It destigmatizes the group by framing it as just a social club or a community movement, making it easier for people to get involved initially.
And they target young people too.
Yes, there are specific channels often used for youth recruitment that bypass traditional gatekeepers. Things like certain genres of racist music, online gaming communities where extremist ideologies can spread, and dedicated websites or forums. These provide easier entry points into the group's worldview for younger individuals.
Okay, so once someone is recruited, what's the socialization process like inside the group? How do they learn the ropes?
It's usually quite intense. New members are systematically taught the group's specific values, ideology, and interpretation of history and current events. This happens through both formal means like study groups, lectures, reading materials, and informal means like participating in group rituals, ceremonies, or community projects.
And isolation plays a part.
A huge part. Members are actively encouraged, or sometimes pressured, to distance themselves from friends, family, or colleagues outside the group who might hold opposing viewpoints. The goal is to create an echo chamber where the group's ideology is constantly reinforced and challenges are minimized. The internet and social networking within the group also play a massive role in this ongoing socialization and isolation.
And for children raised in these groups?
There's often direct parental socialization, teaching the children the group's ideologies from a very young age, embedding it as normal.
What are the main outcomes of this intense socialization?
It leads to some pretty significant shifts. One major outcome is increasing social isolation from the outside world. As relationships with non-members wither, members become more dependent on the group for social connection and validation.
And their identity changes.
Yes, their self-categorization shifts dramatically. They often come to see their racial identity, usually white identity in the context of the North American groups studied, or their specific ideological identity as much more central and defining than it was before. This is SIT's positive distinctiveness, taken to an extreme, often negative conclusion.
And does it make them more prone to accepting violence?
The sources suggest it leads to desensitization. Through constant exposure to hostile rhetoric and dehumanizing portrayals of outgroups, members may become more tolerant of the idea of violence against minorities, even if they don't engage in it themselves. They also become trained to interpret virtually all events, personal setbacks, local news, global politics, solely through the group's rigid racial or ideological lens. Everything confirms the U.S. versus them worldview and the sense of perpetual threat.
It sounds like a powerful conditioning process. But you mentioned earlier that membership isn't always permanent. It's unstable.
That's a key finding and offers a glimmer of hope. Hate group membership is often quite unstable. People do leave, sometimes after relatively short periods.
Why do they leave? What are the main reasons?
Two primary reasons emerge from the research. First, simple disillusionment with the group itself. Maybe the reality of the group, the infighting, the leadership's behavior, the failure to achieve its goals doesn't match the grand, idealized image that was initially presented.
Okay, internal issues. What's the second reason?
The second major reason, and perhaps more encouraging, is forming significant positive relationships outside the group.
Breaking the isolation.
Exactly. Connecting with people who offer alternative perspectives, support, and maybe even a different, more complex sense of identity can break the hold of the group's echo chamber and provide a pathway out. It reminds people of a world beyond the hate group's narrow confines.
That brings us towards the end of this deep dive into the social context of prejudice. It's been a lot to cover.
It really has.
We started with the internal drive, the psychological need for a positive and distinct group identity, explained by social identity theory, SIT. That's the fundamental O's in
Yeah.
action.
Then we move to the external motivators, the feelings of unfairness and resentment when our group feels cheated, which is covered by relative deprivation theory, RDT. That's the blame game.
Right. And then realistic conflict theory, RCT, provided the engine for actual conflict, showing how competition over real resources, tangible or cultural, is often enough to generate hostility, and how dominant groups can use that hostility instrumentally.
Yep, the fight over stuff.
Huh.
And finally, we saw Intergroup Threat Theory, ITT, pull it all together. It synthesized the internal and external, showing how prejudice really ignites when strong in-group identification meets perceived threats, either realistic threats to safety and resources, or symbolic threats to values and culture, or usually both.
So understanding these four frameworks, SIT, RDT, RCT, and ITT, hopefully gives you, the listener, a powerful toolkit. You can use it to quickly categorize and analyze intergroup conflict whenever you encounter it.
Yeah, whether you're looking at geopolitical struggles, tensions in your own community, or even conflicts in your workplace, you can start to ask, is this primarily about identity needs? Is it rooted in perceived injustice? Is it driven by resource competition? Or is it fueled by a potent mix of realistic and symbolic fears?
Knowing this moves you beyond just reacting to conflict towards genuinely analyzing its underlying drivers.
Which is vital if we want to find ways to actually reduce prejudice and hostility.
Absolutely. And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to ponder, building directly on that fascinating SIT finding we discussed, that a more complex social identity tends to foster greater tolerance.
Right, the finding that belonging to multiple diverse groups softens those rigid us versus them lines.
So here's the question. Given that individuals naturally seek that sense of optimal distinctiveness, that balance between belonging and uniqueness, what specific, practical, actionable steps could a community, or even a whole nation, take to actively cultivate a more complex, overlapping, and multifaceted sense of identity among its citizens? How could we intentionally build social structures or promote experiences that encourage people to identify with multiple diverse groups, thereby potentially undermining the very psychological foundations of prejudice?
That's a really challenging question, but a crucial one if we want to move beyond just understanding prejudice to actually combating it, something to definitely think about.